Welcome, dear listener, to a slow and gentle journey back through the corridors of time, to the medieval era world, both distant and yet filled with human experiences that still resonate today. Tonight, we will step softly into the private and intimate lives of men and women who lived centuries ago, exploring how they experienced love, desire, and closeness in a society shaped by faith, tradition, and a complex web of social expectations. As you settle into comfort, imagine yourself in a quiet village or a bustling town of medieval Europe. The sun has long since dipped below the horizon, and the soft glow of candlelight flickers through narrow windows. The air is cool and carries the faint scent of wood smoke mingled with herbs drying in the rafters. Outside, the sounds of the day have faded into the hush of night. Inside humble homes and grand castles alike, families prepare for rest, and couples share moments of tenderness and connection, just as people do today. Yet, the medieval world was very different from our own in many ways. The rhythms of daily life, the rules that governed behavior, and the beliefs that shaped understanding were all deeply influenced by the church and the social structures of the time. Intimacy, in particular, was a realm where desire met duty, where passion was tempered by faith, and where the private was often intertwined with the public. Tonight we will explore this delicate balance, looking beyond myths and stereotypes to uncover the real experiences of medieval men and women, their hopes, fears, and the ways they navigated the complexities of intimacy in a world ruled by strict moral codes and rich cultural traditions. To understand medieval intimacy, we must first understand the world in which it took place. The Middle Ages, spanning roughly from the 5th to the 15th century, were a time of great change and continuity. The fall of the Roman Empire gave way to new kingdoms and societies, all woven together by a shared faith in Christianity. The Church was the center of life, not only as a spiritual institution, but as a powerful social and political force. Its teachings shaped laws, customs, and personal conduct. The idea of sin and virtue permeated everyday decisions, and the body was often seen as a battleground between spiritual purity and earthly temptation. In this context, intimacy was far more than a private matter. It was deeply connected to ideas about morality, community, and the very purpose of human existence. The Church taught that sexual activity was a sacred duty within marriage, primarily for procreation. Outside of this, it was often viewed with suspicion or outright condemnation. However, the lived reality was often more complex. People's desires, relationships, and social interactions frequently diverged from official teachings, revealing a nuanced and sometimes contradictory picture of medieval love and intimacy. Daily life in medieval Europe was structured around the seasons, religious festivals, and social obligations. The Church's calendar dictated not only worship, but also when intimacy was permitted or forbidden. Couples had to navigate these restrictions carefully, balancing personal affection with spiritual discipline. Marriage was often arranged for political or economic reasons. Yet within these unions, individuals sought companionship, comfort, and sometimes passionate connection. Literature and poetry of the time celebrated romantic love and desire, even as the Church emphasized restraint and duty. The medieval home was a place of both warmth and constraint. Privacy was limited, with families often sharing small, crowded living spaces. Yet within these walls, moments of tenderness and intimacy unfolded, shaped by the cultural and religious expectations of the time. The roles of men and women were clearly defined, with women expected to embody modesty and virtue, while men held greater social freedom. These roles influenced how intimacy was expressed and understood, creating a complex dance of power, affection, and obligation. Marriage itself was a complex institution. In many cases, it was arranged by families to secure alliances, wealth, or social standing. Yet the Church recognized marriage as a sacred sacrament, a lifelong commitment blessed by God. Interestingly, medieval law allowed couples to marry simply by mutual consent, sometimes even without a formal ceremony. Physical consummation of the marriage was considered essential to seal the bond, and in some traditions, wedding guests would accompany the couple to their chamber to witness this consummation, ensuring the marriage's legitimacy. This practice, while startling to modern sensibilities, underscores how intertwined public and private life could be. The age of marriage was also notably young by today's standards. Girls as young as 12 and boys around 14 could marry, often without parental consent. This early age reflected different understandings of maturity and the practical needs of society. For many, marriage was the gateway to adulthood, responsibility, and the continuation of family lines. Yet despite these early unions, the emotional and physical realities of medieval intimacy were shaped by a mix of duty, affection, and sometimes genuine love. The Church's teachings on sexual behavior were strict and detailed. Intimacy was permitted only within marriage and primarily for procreation. Many days of the year were designated as times when sexual activity was forbidden, including Sundays, Thursdays, Fridays, and entire seasons such as Lent and Advent. These restrictions meant that the average married couple could legally share intimacy less than once a week. Moreover, the Church discouraged sexual pleasure for its own sake, advocating for modesty and restraint. Certain sexual positions were deemed acceptable, while others were condemned. The missionary position, for example, was promoted as the proper way to engage in intercourse, as it aligned with procreative purposes. Despite these strictures, medieval people found ways to express desire and affection. Literature from the period is rich with stories of courtly love, secret romances, and passionate encounters. The troubadours sang of unattainable ladies and devoted knights, while poets and playwrights explored themes of love, lust, and betrayal. These cultural expressions reveal a society that, while outwardly constrained, was deeply engaged with the complexities of human intimacy. Social attitudes toward sexuality were also marked by double standards. Women were expected to maintain chastity before marriage and fidelity afterward, with harsh social consequences for transgressions. Men, however, often enjoyed greater sexual freedom, and premarital or extramarital relations were more readily overlooked or tolerated. Prostitution, while condemned by the Church, was widespread and sometimes regulated by local authorities. This complex social landscape created tensions and contradictions that shaped everyday life. Medical and spiritual beliefs further influenced medieval intimacy. The body was seen as both a temple and a source of temptation. Sexual activity was believed to affect physical and spiritual health, with certain practices thought to bring harm or sin. Clergy were expected to remain celibate, yet historical records showed that this ideal was not always upheld. The Church's efforts to enforce celibacy and sexual discipline among its own ranks were ongoing and often fraught with difficulty. As we begin this exploration, it is important to remember that the medieval world was not a monolith. Practices and beliefs varied by region, class, and period. What was true for a noble in a castle might differ greatly from the experience of a peasant in a village. Yet across these differences, The tension between desire and discipline, between the sacred and the earthly, remained a central theme in the story of medieval intimacy. Settle in now. Let the stillness of the evening wrap around you like a woolen cloak drawn close on a chilly medieval night. You're resting now, warm, safe, and far away from the echoes of time. And yet, as we drift back into history's hush, a soft rhythm guides us. The rhythm of bells tolling from a stone tower, the rhythm of candlelight flickering beneath arched ceilings, the rhythm of a world tightly ordered by faith and fear. In the medieval world, intimacy was not just personal, it was profoundly spiritual, deeply political, and heavily. Tonight, we'll wander softly into the realm of restriction, where the body was not entirely one's own, but instead belonged at least in part to the church. And what a church it was! Vast, powerful, and everywhere. You see, unlike today, when personal desire often charts its own course. In the Middle Ages, desire had to first check the church calendar. Intimacy wasn't merely a private matter between partners, it was a sacred act, under the watchful eye of clergy and God. It had guidelines, expectations, and consequences. Even married couples had to navigate a maze of religious prohibitions that spanned the week, the season, and the holy year. Let's begin with the days. Sundays, of course, were sacred. They were a time of rest, of gathering for Mass, of contemplating Christ's resurrection. To indulge in physical pleasure on a Sunday was seen as disrespectful, like laughing during a funeral. But Sundays weren't alone. Thursdays and Fridays carried their own weight of holiness. Thursday commemorated Christ's ascension into heaven, a triumph too lofty for earthly passion, and Friday, it marked the sorrowful crucifixion. To make love on a Friday was not only discouraged, it was seen as a moral failing. And that was just the regular week. There were also entire seasons when passion had to pause. Lent, the 40 days of fasting and reflection leading up to Easter, called for abstinence from many things, meat, luxuries, and yes, sex. Married or not, desire was to be set aside, like sweet bread before a fast. Advent brought a similar hush, bidding believers to prepare their souls, not their bodies, for the arrival of Christ. Then came the saints. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of feast days were sprinkled throughout the calendar like snowflakes on a monastery roof. Each one commemorated a holy life, a martyrdom, a miracle, and each one carried an expectation of purity. If today was St. Agnes's Day, if it was the octave of St. Michael, you refrained, and so on. These restrictions could turn entire months into spiritual deserts where the body was asked to slumber. Now, picture this. A couple, devoted but weary, lying together in their cottage, whispering beneath their fur blankets. The fire has dwindled, the children are asleep, and the moonlight slips through the shutters. But still, a question lingers like incense in the air. Is tonight allowed? They whisper dates, they count back the Sundays. Is it Lent? Is it the eve of a feast? Can they hold each other without fear of sin? There was no intimacy without theology. Every touch, every kiss, every longing glance was weighed against the holy ledger of time. And this wasn't just superstition, it was doctrine. Monks wrote books on the matter. Priests preached sermons about it. Penitentials' manuals for confessors listed specific punishments for acts committed on forbidden days. But even when the stars aligned and the calendar gave its quiet permission, there were more rules to follow. The Church's ideal was crystal clear. Sex was for procreation. Full stop. It was meant to create children, nothing more. Pleasure. Suspicious. Desire. Dangerous. Love. Perhaps, but only if it led to duty. The only fully acceptable context for sexual union was within a marriage, and even then it was to be practiced with modesty, gravity, and purpose. It was a task, not a treasure. It was holy work, not holy joy. And the guidelines didn't stop there. Certain positions were forbidden not because of health or practicality but because they were believed to invite excess pleasure. The missionary position, named much later, of course was considered acceptable because it mimicked natural order. Man above, woman beneath, no frivolity, no novelty. Anything else, anything that introduced delight, creativity, or mutual exploration was whispered about in confessionals and frowned upon by theologians. Theologians like St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas spoke at length about sexual ethics. For them, pleasure that strayed too far from procreation was akin to gluttony, indulgence of the flesh over the soul. One must be careful, they warned. The devil was never far from the bedsheet. But the story, like all good stories, has its complications, because people, whether peasants or nobles, monks or midwives, are never quite so simple. Despite the rules, despite the fear, despite the weight of divine judgment, human hearts beat on. They longed. They touched. They whispered secrets in barn lofts and back alleys. Love, after all, is a quiet rebellion. And even in a world wrapped in rules, people found their way to each other. Some obeyed the church wholeheartedly. Others obeyed publicly but rebelled privately. Some confessed and wept and promised to abstain. Others winked at the saints and snuck under blankets, trusting in forgiveness to follow pleasure. The line between sin and survival was often blurred. And yet, even the rebels carried the burden of guilt. The church's teachings were not light suggestions. They were carved into sermons, painted in chapel murals, etched into stained glass. Hellfire was a real threat, and salvation a narrow bridge. Every choice mattered. Every night could tip the scales of eternity. Imagine, then, the tension a man and woman, deeply in love, knowing that even their deepest connection might need repentance, and yet to deny that connection entirely was to deny a piece of themselves. It was a paradox, tender and tormenting, and it didn't end with lovers. Confessors, those who heard the sins of the village, became spiritual gatekeepers of desire. A woman might admit to feeling too much joy in her marriage bed. A man might confess to longing for his wife when he should have been thinking of God. And the priest, perhaps struggling with his own humanity, would assign prayers, fasts, penances. The cycle was constant. Desire, indulgence, guilt, confession, forgiveness, a rhythm as old as time, set to the tune of bells and whispered prayers. But not everyone fit the mold. There were always exceptions, quiet ones, strange ones, people who loved in forbidden ways, who found joy in corners the church never fully reached. There were folk healers and wise women who spoke of the body with reverence, not shame. There were troubadours who sang of passion and poems that hinted at secret meetings. There were even clergy who failed to uphold their vows. Scandals simmered beneath the cassocks, and there were those who didn't believe at all, who saw the rules as chains, who laughed behind barn doors and lived their lives on instinct rather than instruction. We don't hear their voices often. History wasn't kind to rebels, but they were there. So what does this all tell us? It tells us that the medieval world was not grey and silent. It was textured, layered, humming with contradiction. The church had its ideals, but people had their needs. And somewhere between the pulpit and the pillow, humanity persisted. The church taught that the flesh was weak, But history shows us it was also persistent. Rules were written, yes, but they were bent, broken, challenged, and rewritten in the quiet spaces of everyday life. That's what makes this history so compelling, not the dogma, but the defiance. And so, as your eyes grow heavy and your breath slows, think of that couple again. Maybe they're just villagers, with rough hands and tender hearts. Maybe they're afraid. Maybe they're in love. Maybe they're just cold and seeking warmth. But tonight they lie close, and somewhere in the distance a bell rings. The church says wait. The heart says now. And in that tension lies the truth not just of the medieval world, but of every world, the eternal dance between desire and doctrine, between body and soul, between sin and something soft. Good evening again, dear friend. As we drift deeper into the soft shadows of the medieval world, I invite you to relax even more. Let the candlelight in your mind flicker gently as we enter homes built of timber and stone, and hearts bound by custom, duty, and the occasional spark of tender rebellion. Tonight, we're curling into the quiet heart of domestic life, into the hushed, cloistered world of marriage, gender roles, and expectations. Close your eyes, imagine a quiet village, tucked between green fields and winding dirt roads. The sky is heavy with the dusk of centuries past, and inside a modest home, two families gather not for a celebration of love, but for an arrangement. You see, in medieval times, marriage wasn't so much about passion or butterflies in the belly. It was a transaction, a bond made not of whispers and kisses, but of coins, land, and family strategy. Imagine a young girl, perhaps just 12 or 13, standing quietly beside her father as he discusses her future with another man, her future husband. The girl's voice rarely enters the conversation. Her worth is measured not by her dreams or desires, but by her dowry, possessions or money she will bring into the marriage. A cow, a patch of land, perhaps a few silver coins passed from one calloused hand to another. In return, her husband's family offers security, a home, and a future path shaped like a narrow road. Marriage in this world was a contract, often arranged with little regard for romance. Especially among the nobility, weddings were tools of diplomacy, unions to merge estates, secure peace, or strengthened bloodlines. Even among peasants, love came later, if at all. The church oversaw these unions, blessing them with sacred rites, but their true roots lay in law and economy. Two families joined, not two souls. Now, gently drift your thoughts to the expectations placed upon each partner once married. For women, life was tightly bound. A married woman was expected to be modest and chaste, her voice soft, her head bowed, her body, her behavior, her very presence in the home all were to reflect virtue. Honor wasn't just personnel, it was for a wife's reputation could elevate or destroy her household's standing in the community. And so, women walked carefully. Their attire was regulated to avoid temptation, no flashy colors, no revealing fabrics. Their work was ceaseless caring for children, preparing meals, spinning wool, brewing ale, and keeping house. But above all, a woman's central role was to bear children. Fertility was prized. A wife who bore sons was blessed. One who failed to conceive might be whispered about behind her back, or worse, blamed and shamed. The burden of modesty fell heavily. While men had more social leeway, a woman's virtue was often considered the family's most valuable asset. Any deviation from expected behavior, whether flirtation, rumor, or actual affair, could lead to punishment. A noble woman might be cast out, disinherited, or sent to a convent. A peasant woman might face physical punishment or community scorn. Even a whisper of scandal could ruin a reputation. Yet, despite these tight boundaries, women found moments of strength. In some homes, the lady of the house ran affairs while her husband traveled or fought in distant wars. Some women became midwives, herbalists, even property owners in widowhood. There were queens who wielded quiet power from behind the throne. Still, the rules of marriage and modesty held strong. One wrong move could mean everything unraveling. Men, on the other hand, lived under a different set of expectations. They were the heads of households, decision-makers, landowners, and laborers. A husband was expected to protect and provide, but he was also granted more freedom in his personal life. A married man could, and often did, seek out prostitutes with far fewer consequences. Adultery was frowned upon in theory but in practice it was often overlooked if committed by men. While women risked disgrace for stepping outside marital bounds, men were forgiven, or at least tolerated. Their transgressions were often chalked up to nature, temptation, or stress. If a nobleman fathered a child out of wedlock, the child might be acknowledged and even raised within the household. If a woman did the same, she might be disowned or worse. Society tilted the scales firmly in favor of male privilege. In brothels, the veil of modesty was temporarily lifted. These establishments, though morally condemned by the church, were quietly accepted by city authorities. Taxes were collected, rules enforced, and as long as things remained discreet, no one looked too closely. For men, these were spaces to explore without judgment. For the women who worked there, life was a complex balance of survival and stigma. But let's not imagine all marriages were loveless or cold. Amid the contracts and customs, real affection sometimes bloomed. A husband and wife might grow fond of each other over time, share laughter over bread and ale, or find comfort in their shared labors. There were stories of deep partnerships, tender letters between spouses, and moments of sweetness whispered in bed before the hearth. Love could be a slow ember rather than a sudden flame. Still, the structure of marriage was rigid. Divorce, as we understand it today, was nearly impossible. The Church viewed marriage as indissoluble, a sacred bond that could not be undone. Annulments existed, but they required special permission and often involved great expense or influence. For most, marriage was a one-way road, with no exits, no matter how unhappy the journey. As for gender roles beyond marriage, they too were deeply entrenched. Men were warriors, craftsmen, scholars, and priests. Women were expected to nurture, serve, and obey. Education was rare for girls. Unless they joined religious life, their world was smaller, confined by walls both literal and social. Yet within those walls, women wove lives of complexity, of care, of quiet, resistance, and occasional triumph. And so, as we float further into this sleepy reverie, imagine the medieval household once again. The fire burns low. The wife mends clothing in the glow of the embers. The husband sharpens a blade or reads a prayer aloud. The children sleep nearby. Outside, the world is dark and uncertain, but within, they follow the roles they were given. Sometimes with joy, sometimes with resignation, always with the weight of expectation on their shoulders. Let your thoughts settle now, wrapped in the warmth of imagined hearths and age-old customs. In this world of quiet rules and loud silences, of constrained freedoms and complicated hearts, we see again how history breathes not through kings or battles but through ordinary lives, lived one soft moment at a time. When you're ready, we'll move gently into our next tale where the stories get a little more tangled, and the truths even more curious. Let your body sink a little deeper into comfort. Feel the blankets draped over you like the woolen cloaks of those who once wandered medieval courts. With ink-stained fingers and half-broken hearts, we re-knot in the bedrooms of lords and ladies tonight. We in the quiet spaces between words, in the aching stanzas of old poems, in the hush that follows when love cannot quite speak aloud. Now imagine yourself in the grand hall of a 12th century castle. The stone walls are high, thick, and cold, but tapestries hang to soften their bite. A minstrel tunes a lute by the fire, preparing to sing a new ballad about love so perfect, so painful, it must surely have been penned by an angel or perhaps someone recently heartbroken. A lady sits by the window, her embroidery still for a moment, her gaze lost in thought. Somewhere across the room, a knight stands, watching her not with desire, not with hope, but with reverence. That is courtly love. You see, in the medieval imagination, courtly love was not about marriage, or even necessarily about physical intimacy. It was about admiration from afar. Often it meant a nobleman or a knight would devote himself wholly to a lady, usually of higher status or already married, offering her his loyalty, his protection, and sometimes his poetry. She became, in a sense, his muse and his moral compass. But this affection was meant to remain unconsummated, hovering like a candle flame just out of reach. Why, you might wonder, would love be imagined in such distant terms? Why offer your heart without expecting anything in return? The answer lies partly in the social structures of the time. Marriages, especially among the nobility, were rarely based on personal affection. They were contract arrangements between families to exchange wealth, land, or political power. Love, if it came at all, was an afterthought, and so people turned to stories and songs to explore the more delicate parts of the human heart. They dreamed on parchment what they could not live in stone halls. Picture a knight returning from battle, armor dusty, heart bruised from more than just war. He writes a letter perhaps, even a poem to a lady he has seen only once, who gave him a favor at a tournament. A ribbon, a smile, she becomes the light toward which his soul leans. In his verses, she is perfect, holy, even he is not worthy of her, and he knows it. That is what makes the love pure. To love and not possess that was the ideal. These poetic traditions were not just idle fantasies. They shaped real culture. Troubadours and minstrels traveled from court to court in the regions of Occitania, Provence, and northern Italy, singing of lovesick knights and distant dames. Their songs became the social soundtrack of elite circles. And so, courtly love became a kind of game, a stylized way of expressing desire without breaking the moral codes of the church, least not openly. And yes, sometimes the feelings moved from parchment to pillow. Not all knights and ladies were content to leave their longing locked in verse, but even when the love remained chaste, the emotional intensity could be overwhelming. Think of it like a medieval slow burn. Each glance, each token, perhaps a scarf or a single flower, carried the weight of 1,000 words. In some stories, even touching the lady's hand was a privilege that sent a knight into poetic ecstasy. This kind of love had its own rules. In fact, medieval writers went so far as to compose entire manuals on how courtly love should be conducted. One famous example is Andreas Capellanesi's The Art of Courtly Love, written in the 12th century. In it, he outlines how noble hearts should behave. Discreetly, passionately, loyally. True love, according to him, must be secret, and once revealed, must never fade. He claimed that love ennobled the heart, refined the soul, and sharpened one's virtues. It was not just desire, it was a discipline. But courtly love wasn't all heartbreak and high ideals. It had its flirtations, its playful wit. Imagine two noble lovers exchanging rhymed insults during a game of chess, each move a poetic jab, each smile a silent invitation. Or picture a lady dropping her handkerchief accidentally near the knight, who just swore to protect her honor. These were not acts of seduction, they were acts of literary devotion, of performing one's heart like a song. And in a strange twist, this romantic ideal also offered women a rare form of power. Within marriage, a woman might be upon traded wed, and expected to serve, but as the object of courtly love, she became the sun in someone's universe. She held the emotional reins. She could grant or deny her knight's affection with a word, a look. In the song, she was no longer just a wife, she was a queen of hearts. Now, let's drift into a quieter room, perhaps a lady's solar, where she reads. By candlelight, a small book of poems slipped to her by a trusted maid. Each stanza contains a secret, a sigh, a longing that may never be fulfilled. She is married, perhaps, to a man twice her age, who speaks only of land disputes and church tithes. But in these lines, she feels seen, and that, more than anything, is the true gift of courtly love. But not all stories were sweet. Some poets told of lovers who crossed lines, who ran away together, defied their families, or died for their passion. These tales served as both inspiration and warning. Love is beautiful, yes, but dangerous if left untamed. The Church viewed these ideas warily. Passion was a fire that could light a candle or burn down a convent. Many clergymen condemned courtly love for promoting lust disguised as virtue. But the people, especially the young and restless, continued to listen, to sing, and to dream. One can imagine a newlywed couple, strangers until the moment they exchanged vows, trying to find comfort in each other's presence. They may lie in silence at first. Shy, uncertain, he dreams of the lady who once smiled at him during a festival. She remembers the baker's apprentice, who used to leave sweet rolls near her window. Real love, emotional connection, had to be found, or created, outside the boundaries of arranged marriage. Courtly love was the escape, the song they sang to their hearts, when marriage felt like a cage. As night deepens around us, it's worth reflecting on how these stories live on. We still cherish slow glances, secret notes, love that aches but doesn't demand. Even now, we seek connection not just in the body, but in shared words, shared thoughts. And isn't that what courtly love was all about? A soul recognizing another, even if only for a moment, even if only in song. So, as your eyes grow heavy and your breath slows, picture yourself in that medieval courtyard. The stars are high above. Somewhere a lute plays softly, and a knight leans against a stone pillar, reciting a verse he has memorized 100 times, hoping his lady will hear it from her tower window. He does not expect a kiss, or even a smile. He only wishes to be seen, to be remembered, to matter. Let's imagine, for a moment, a village priest preparing his Sunday sermon. The parchment before him speaks sternly of sin, of restraint, of temptation lurking in every whisper and glance. He adjusts his robes and glances out the stained glass window only to see, just outside, a young couple stealing a kiss in the orchard's shadow. He sighs. He's seen this before. The words he preaches are not always the rules they follow. You see, in this world, official doctrine was one thing, but daily life had its own current. There was a space between public piety and private action, a space where people lived, worked, touched, and longed. Take premarital intimacy. Though it was condemned, it was more common than many might assume. The Church insisted that sex was only proper within marriage, and ideally for procreation. Yet, in the quiet warmth of barns, in the hush of haylofts, in candlelit cottages when parents had gone to sleep, young people sometimes followed different rules, not out of rebellion, but out of something much simpler. Affection, curiosity, love. Some were already promised to each other, betrothed in all but ceremony. In those cases, physical closeness was seen as inevitable, even if not quite forgivable, and though the parish priest might frown, the midwife down the lane had likely seen it all before. In fact, many parish records hint that a number of medieval brides arrived at the altar already pregnant. A quiet nod to what everyone knew, but no one said aloud. Let's walk now through a spring fair. Booths brim with sweet apples and warm loaves. Minstrels sing ballads of brave knights and beautiful maidens. Beneath it all, a quieter exchange takes place. Lingering glances, hands brushing while passing bread, tokens slipped into aprons. It's here, among laughter and music, that flirtation bloomed, often unnoticed by the watchful eyes of clergy. But intimacy came with risk, not just spiritual, but physical. Without a scientific understanding of disease, people relied on a mixture of folk belief and church teaching. If a child was born with a deformity, some whispered it was punishment for lovemaking during forbidden days. If illness spread, blame might fall on those believed to live sinfully, including prostitutes and adults. And yet, these beliefs were not always enough to change behavior. The human heart is not easily governed by fear alone. So people did what they have always done. They balanced, they listened to sermons, and crossed themselves piously, then visited the local healer for a protective charm. They obeyed the calendar of saints by day, and perhaps whispered sweet nothings into the dark at night. Now let us peer into a brothel, not as voyeurs, but as quiet historians. The air is thick with perfumed oil and old wood. Silk hangs in the windows, though it's faded with time. A woman, no longer young, adjusts her hair and smooths her skirt. Another hums softly as she waits. These are not nameless shadows. These are women with stories. Prostitution was both condemned and, curiously, institutionalized. Many towns had official brothels, taxed and regulated. Some even had matrons to ensure that clients treated the women with a basic level of respect. The church disapproved loudly, but civil full well that desire doesn't vanish with a decree allowed these places to exist. It was a moral compromise hidden behind bureaucracy, and for some women, this life, as precarious as it was, offered a strange kind of independence. They could earn wages, make choices, and live outside the constraints of traditional marriage. But the cost was steep. Social stigma never left them, and their health was always at risk. Still, their existence reveals how medieval society was often more pragmatic than we imagine. The contradiction lay everywhere. Monks preached chastity, yet records tell of secret affairs and scandalous births in abbeys. Married men visited brothels, then attended mass, Women warned their daughters to stay pure, but many had their own tangled histories. There was judgment, yes, but also a kind of resigned understanding. People knew that the heart, like the body, didn't always obey. It's important to remember, though, that not everyone had equal freedom. Men had more leeway socially and sexually. They could misstep and return to favor. Women bore the greater burden. A single indiscretion could ruin a reputation forever. Virginity was a currency, modesty a shield, and yet, even within these limits, women found ways to assert agency, to choose lovers, to reject proposals, to whisper their own desires into the night. Let us now return to the soft flicker of a village hearth. A mother sews while her daughter asks quiet questions about love, about marriage, about what truly matters. The mother answers carefully, mixing what the church says with what life has taught her. Be good, she might say, but don't be a fool. Listen to your heart, but keep your eyes open. That was the real lesson of medieval intimacy, not one of blind obedience, nor of open rebellion, but of balance. People believed deeply in sin, in punishment, in eternal judgment, but they also believed in each other, in warmth, in love, in the quiet comfort of shared beds and morning bread. Desire, after all, didn't vanish under a bishop's ring or a monk's chant. It lived in glances and laughter, in gifts tucked into sleeves, in the hush between prayers. And so the people of the Middle Ages, like us, found ways to live with their contradictions. They navigated a world where sin and sanctity were never far apart. So let your thoughts settle now. Friend, picture those narrow streets, those candlelit rooms, those whispered secrets behind old stone walls. Remember that even in the most pious of times, the human heart beat on, timid, hopeful, and always seeking connection. And as the stars rise above the cloister and the village alike, we leave this chapter gently behind, our steps light and our minds full of wonder. The past, as always, was more human than holy, and its stories, softly told, still echo in the hush of our own lives. The moonlight filters softly through the thatched roof, dappling the stone floor with faint silvery lines. The village is hushed. A distant owl hoots. Somewhere beyond the fields, a dog barks once and then is silent. And within one small wooden cottage, tucked beneath woolen blankets, two young people lie side by side, their hands just barely touching in the dark. They are not yet married, but their hearts and, perhaps, more have already wandered past the line, drawn by their priest, that this is the quiet beginning of many stories from the Middle Ages. While the sermons were stern and the doctrine clear, the hearts of people beat in a language far older than Scripture. And tonight, dear listener, we'll explore this tension between the world as it was preached and the world as it was lived. The realm where rules met reality, where love, longing, and sometimes betrayal played out not in legends, but in cottages and castles alike. Let's start with something simple and yet not so simple at all. Premarital sex. The church's position was clear. It was forbidden. Intimacy, they said, belonged only within the sacred union of marriage. Anything else was sin, lust outside wedlock, a danger to the soul. It could taint a woman's reputation, cast shame upon a family, even risk the legitimacy of future children. And yet, despite these warnings, it was common. So common, in fact, that parish records, court cases, and even songs suggest it was a quiet but accepted part of rural life. Why? Because, in many places, betrothal was already treated as a kind of soft marriage. A promise to wed was enough for some couples to begin sharing more than just whispered words. They might not yet have stood before the altar, but their futures were joined in spirit, if not yet in ceremony, and the consequences, not always harsh. In some towns, a child born before the wedding simply arrived early. If the couple married soon after, the gossip faded fast. Sometimes the community turned a blind eye. After all, who among them hadn't felt the same stirrings in youth? In the cities, things were different, more public, more recorded, and more watched. Their premarital intimacy was less hidden. Love letters, gifts, stolen hours, young apprentices caught in haylofts, noble daughters found to be with child. There were punishments, of course, fines, confessions, public penance, but even then the reality rarely matched the rigidity of the law. Let us now turn our gaze to extramarital affairs. The forbidden kind of love, the secret glances, the stolen hours. The stories written between lines and behind closed doors. In noble courts, these affairs could become courtly tales dressed up in poetry and riddles. A knight pledging himself to a lady not his wife. A noblewoman exchanging letters with a troubadour. These dalliances were often romanticized, seen not just as sin, but as symbols of passion, of beauty, of heartbreak. But not all affairs were so poetic. Many were simple, fleshly things. A baker and the miller's wife, a married lord and a serving girl. And the consequences were not equal. For women, the risks were enormous. Adultery could mean public shame, exile, even death. A woman caught betraying her vows might find herself paraded through the streets or locked away in a convent. Her children might be labeled illegitimate. Her name, once whispered in affection, now spit in scorn. Men, on the other hand, often faced fewer repercussions. A lord might be scolded by a bishop, but rarely punished beyond that. A married man's affair was excused, at times, as a lapse, moment of weakness. Society often looked the other way, especially if he was wealthy or powerful. And so, the imbalance grew. Women were judged harshly, men leniently. A wife could lose everything for one indiscretion. A husband might boast of many and lose nothing at all. Still, women were not always victims of the system. Some wielded their charm and wit to great effect. There are tales, true ones, of queens and noblewomen who carried on long affairs, protected by status, secrecy, and loyal friends, and in villages where everyone knew everyone else. Clever women learned how to navigate the delicate dance of reputation and reality. Let's walk again quietly through a medieval town square. A woman sells herbs from a small stall. Her husband is often away, trading in other cities. She smiles at a passing monk. They speak often, some say too often, but nothing is proven. Nothing is said aloud. And yet, behind that smile, 1,000 stories may unfold. Affairs, whether romantic or physical, were often shaped by proximity. Servants and masters, tenants and lords, confessors and penitents, power played a role. Opportunity, but above all, so did desire, the timeless, complicated emotion that doesn't heed rules or roles. Now, let's shift our gaze to the clergy. Monks and priests were sworn to celibacy. Their lives were meant to be chaste, devoted wholly to God. But, even here, the reality often wavered. There are countless records of priests fathering children, of monks sneaking out of abbeys at night. Some took lovers in secret, some quite openly. In some towns, the priest's children were an open secret, accepted with a wink and a shrug. The church tried to police these behaviors. Councils were held, edicts issued, but hearts are not changed by parchment alone. Even those who preached restraint sometimes fell prey to longing. Their failures, though whispered, were real. And what of same-sex love? That too existed quietly, dangerously, sometimes tenderly. Though strictly forbidden, it left traces. In poetry, in letters, in court records, in accusations hurled in anger. The punishments were harsh, but the feelings, they were human. And so, despite risk, such relationships still blossomed, hidden behind friendship, cloaked in affection. As we near the end of this chapter, let us not imagine the medieval world as one of only darkness or repression. Let us see it for what it truly was. A world of contradictions, where people believed in sin and yet sought pleasure, where love defied sermons, where quiet affection bloomed beneath heavy rules. Tonight, as you rest, know that history does not only live in scrolls and cathedrals. It lives in stolen kisses and whispered vows, in the hands that reached for each other despite the world's judgment, and in the hearts that dared to hope even when hope was forbidden. Tonight, our journey takes a turn toward the quiet, cobbled-back alleys of medieval towns, toward dim lanterns and crooked signs, where footsteps echoed off stone long after the bells of Compline had rung. This is not a tale of scandal or vice, but one of humanity, of women, sometimes men who lived at the margins, and of a society that both condemned and relied upon them. Let's talk, softly and without judgment, about the world of prostitution in medieval Europe. It's a curious thing, really. For all the stern teachings of the Church, for all the warnings about sin and damnation, prostitution was not banished from medieval life. It was, in fact, surprisingly tolerated, like a stone in a shoe, uncomfortable but impossible to remove. The people of that time recognized, quietly and often reluctantly, that the flesh would not always yield to rules. In towns from Paris to Prague, from York to Florence, prostitution was part of the urban fabric. Not in grand halls or noble houses, but in tightly packed districts, usually near the edge of town or by the city gates. These areas, sometimes officially marked, sometimes unofficially known, offered a kind of space where desire, money, and moral ambiguity coexisted. The Church, of course, frowned deeply upon such things. Prostitution was labeled a sin, an affront to the sanctity of marriage and the purity of the soul. Yet, paradoxically, some theologians defended its existence. Better, they said, for a man to seek release with a prostitute than to seduce a virgin or commit adultery with another man's wife. It was, in their eyes, the lesser evil. St. Augustine himself once suggested that removing prostitution from society would unleash chaos. And so, rather than stamp it out, many cities regulated it. Yes, regulated it. With rules, with fines, even with designated zones. In some towns, prostitutes had to register with the local authorities. They were often required to wear specific clothing, yellow hoods, or striped dresses that marked them as what they were. Not to shame them, necessarily, but to distinguish them. To set them apart, they were forbidden from entering churches, barred from walking in certain parts of the city during daylight. In some cases, they were not allowed to live within the town walls, and had to retreat to the fringes at night, and yet they were there. In every market town, in every port, near monasteries, along pilgrimage routes, wherever there were people, there was longing. And wherever there was longing, there were those who met it, for coin, for food, sometimes for protection. Let us wander for a moment, shall we? Imagine a narrow street in a medieval town. It's evening, the shops are closing. The blacksmith has put out his coals. Children are being ushered indoors. And in a small house with red shutters, A candle glows in the upper window. A sign, perhaps, a discreet carving of Venus. Or a simple red ribbon signals that this is no ordinary home. Inside, a woman smooths her skirt and adjusts her linen headscarf. Her name is not known to most. She may go by an alias. She is not what the church praises, but she is not evil either. She is a survivor. And survival, dear listener, was not easy for women in the Middle Ages, with limited rights, no access to higher education, and few legal protections. Many women faced stark choices. A widow with no sons might turn to prostitution, rather than starve. A young girl cast out for bearing a child might end up in a brothel, not by desire but by necessity. And for some, born into it or sold into it, the path was laid before they could choose anything at all. Were all prostitutes poor? Not always. Some made a reasonable living enough to feed themselves, clothe themselves, sometimes even save a little. In some cases, brothels were owned and managed by women who had once worked in them. Others worked independently, visiting wealthy clients or hosting them discreetly. And yet the risk was constant. Disease, violence, exploitation. The laws that offered protection to other citizens often did not extend to them. If a client refused to pay or worst, there was little recourse. Some cities, interestingly, set up municipal brothels. These were run not by private owners, but by the city itself. The idea was to control the trade, minimize crime, and reduce the spread of disease. In Vienna, for example, the government operated a brothel in the 15th century. It was not hidden. It was taxed. Such brothels had rules. The women were inspected by physicians at least nominally. They could only work on certain days, at certain times. They could not solicit in public. And in some places, they were even banned from using perfumes or wearing bright colors, lest they tempt too strongly. Yet, despite these restrictions, many clientsmen of all classes, nobles, merchants, soldiers, clergy, it was said that during festivals and fairs, brothels overflowed. Wine, laughter, coin, and then silence again once the revelers had gone home. What did the women feel? Some memoirs, though rare, suggest a complex mixture of resignation and resilience. For many, this was a job, a way to survive in a world that offered few choices. There were friendships among the women, moments of kindness, laughter, even, and sometimes love. Love, yes, it happened. There are tales, half-whispered, half-recorded, prostitutes who fell in love with clients, and of clients who abandoned everything to marry a woman they had met in such a place. These were not common, and not always happy, but they were real. Society, though, did not forgive easily. A woman who had once worked in a brothel might be denied marriage, housing, or even burial in consecrated ground. Even if she left that life behind, the stain remained in the eyes of many. And yet the contradiction endured. The same townspeople who would shun her on Sunday might visit her on Saturday night. The same priests who preached chastity might turn a blind eye when their brothers strayed. Some monasteries, in fact, were notorious for their proximity to brothels. Pilgrimage sites, to pilgrims full of piety and wine, sometimes found themselves slipping into places that the saints would not approve. And so, prostitution remained a tolerated sin, a necessary evil, an open secret. There were efforts to reform it, of course. Religious orders that tried to rescue women from brothels, charitable houses that offered shelter and repentance, but not all who left could stay away. Some returned, driven by hunger or despair. Theologians debated whether a prostitute could be saved. Could she confess and be forgiven? Could she enter heaven? The answers were murky. It depended. Some said, on whether she truly repented. Others argued that if she did not enjoy the act, if she did it for survival, then perhaps her sin was lighter. In paintings and sermons, prostitutes were often linked with Mary Magdalene, the penitent sinner, a woman redeemed by faith. But even this was fraught. The line between redemption and condemnation was thin, and often walked barefoot. Let us now close the shutters gently. The candle has burned low. The footsteps on the street have faded, and the woman inside curls beneath her thin blanket, eyes closed. The ache of the day heavy in her limbs, she is not remembered in chronicles. No bard sings of her name, but she was there, night after night, in every town and city, a witness to the contradiction of a world that preached purity and practiced indulgence. Tonight, as you rest, perhaps there's comfort in knowing that history is not just the story of kings and crusades. It is also the story of those who stood in the shadows, who endured, who lived their truths quietly in defiance of judgment. And so, with a heart full of softness, let us leave this chapter behind. Let your breathing slow. Let your mind settle. The past is quiet now, and soon so will you be. Let your eyes rest. Let the warmth of your blanket settle gently around your shoulders. For the story we tell tonight is not of war or kings, but of the human body and the ancient ways people once understood its mysteries. Tonight we listen to how medieval minds made sense of intimacy, not just through the heart or through doctrine, but through the strange and delicate lens of health and spirit. In the Middle Ages, there was no sharp divide between what we might now call science and religion. The physician and the priest often spoke with the same voice, echoing truths shaped by scripture, by ancient Greek philosophy, and by the shifting sands of superstition. When people thought about the body, especially in its most private acts, they did not separate flesh from soul. They were woven together, like threads in a linen shroud. Let's start with what we might call medicine. Though even that word wore different robes back then. Most medieval Europeans believed the body was governed by four bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood. This idea, borrowed from the writings of ancient thinkers like Galen and Hippocrates, held sway over doctors for centuries. Health, they believed, was a delicate balance of these fluids, and sexious, even that could tip the scales. Too much desire could overheat the body. Too little could cause stagnation of the humors. One medical text even claimed that if a woman went too long without intimacy, her womb might become restless, the body in search of relief. This wandering womb, they said, could cause fainting, hysteria, or madness. Yes, truly, that was believed. So, to some physicians, sex within reason was not sinful but therapeutic. A married couple engaging in moderate, lawful intimacy could be said to be maintaining their health. It relieved pressure, released heat, and kept the balance of the humors in check. But moderation was key. Too much intimacy, especially too much pleasure, was considered dangerous. It could deplete the vital spirits, weaken the eyesight, damage the spine. One famous medical manual warned that too frequent relations could dry the bones and shorten life expectancy. And yet, in contradiction, other texts sometimes written by the very same scholars claimed that a happy marriage, with regular physical connection, was the secret to longevity. It was all so wonderfully, sleepily contradictory. Of course, men and women were thought to experience the act very differently. Medical authors argued that men released seed, while women's bodies warmed and opened in response. Some even insisted that for a woman to conceive, she had to feel pleasured, because that was what allowed her seed to mix with the man's. Without that pleasure, they said, conception could not occur. This belief had strange legal consequences. In some trials of assault or misconduct, a woman's pregnancy was seen as evidence that she must have enjoyed the act. The law, bound up in flawed medicine, often failed to understand or believe the reality of pain and coercion. These misunderstandings were not born of cruelty, necessarily, but of ignorance. The body was a mystery, and where knowledge failed, people filled the gaps with imagination. Clergy, too, had their thoughts on the matter. Many priests, especially those who had studied in monasteries or cathedral schools, read the same medical texts as physicians. They were expected to guide their flock not just in matters of salvation, but in health. So a confession might include not only sins of the soul, but questions about bodily urges. And sin, of course, was deeply tangled with the body. Lust, after all, was one of the 7 deadly sins. Church fathers like Augustine and Jerome taught that the fall Adam and Eve's expulsion from Eden had tainted human desire. Intimacy, once pure, had become something to be restrained. Marriage, they said, was a concession to weakness's sacred structure designed to contain temptation. Still, not all church leaders were so severe. Some counseled gentleness. They advised husbands to be patient, to avoid selfishness, to see their wives as partners, not objects. It was not always practiced, but the ideal, at least, existed in writing. Spiritual texts often linked physical closeness with moral danger. A couple was warned not to engage in acts that were too joyful, too spontaneous. It was best to lie still, face to face, with the lights dimmed or, preferably, out and the words silent. Some church manuals even listed acceptable days and positions. Anything else was branded as excess. Even laughter during the act was discouraged. But again, the lines were blurred. Monks wrote love poetry in secret. Nuns dreamed of mystical marriages to Christ, describing spiritual ecstasy in words that sometimes mirrored physical longing. The language of the body, it seemed, could not be fully erased from the language of faith. People also believed that sin could linger in the body. A person who indulged in too much pleasure might carry spiritual impurities. They might fall ill not because of bacteria or viruses, which were unknown, but because the body had been weakened by lust. Diseases of the skin, in particular, were often linked to moral failure. Sores, rashes, even trembling hands, these were interpreted as signs of unclean living. To purify the body, people turned to fasting, prayer, and pilgrimage. A man who had strayed might walk barefoot for miles, wearing a rough woolen shirt that scratched his skin. A woman might donate to a convent or burn her fine dresses as a gesture of repentance. Healing, then, was not just about ointments and herbs. It was about the soul. Still, apothecaries and wise women offered remedies. Herbs like yarrow, mugwort, and pennyroyal were used to regulate the body. Some were given as teas or tinctures, others as poultices or incense. Midwives knew which herbs might stir desire and which might suppress it. Some, whispered about but rarely written, were used to end pregnancies. These women, part healer and part midwife, walked a fine line. Too much knowledge could lead to suspicion. They were useful until they were feared, and yet villagers came to them quietly, with questions they could not ask the priest, with ailments they could not name aloud. Desire, fertility, disappointment, these were the quiet troubles of daily life, and they needed answers. Men to sought cures. Medieval texts are full of recipes to strengthen virility. Mixtures of ground antler, honey, onions, and even powdered stone were swallowed with hope. Amulets were worn, charms whispered. There was also the belief in the evil eye, a glance that could sap a man's strength or make a woman barren. Protection spells were common, sewn into clothing or hidden under beds. One of the strangest beliefs of the time involved the moon. People believed that lunar phases influenced fertility. A full moon was considered a time of heightened desire and potency. Some couples timed their attempts to conceive based on the moon's glow, casting shadows across cold stone floors. All of this medicine, prayer, ritual painted a picture of a world where the body was never just the body. It was a vessel, a battleground, a bridge between earth and heaven. And in this world, intimacy was both feared and cherished. It was something to be regulated, but also secretly celebrated. Behind all the sermons and scrolls, there was the quiet truth that people still yearned. They still touched. They still hoped to feel close to another human being, if only for a moment. So, as you lie here, dear listener, in the quiet comfort of now, take a moment to breathe in the weight of that ancient understanding. The people of the Middle Ages did not have our words or our science, but they had hearts that beat just as yours does now. They wondered, they worried, they tried to balance desire and duty, health and holiness, instinct and instruction, and perhaps, in their candlelit rooms and whispered prayers, they found moments of peace. Just as you will. Now, let your thoughts drift back from those stone walls and flickering tapers. Let the echo of their voices fade into silence. You are here, safe and still, wrapped in softness. Let your breathing settle as we draw together the soft, tangled threads of the story we've been telling. This isn't just a history lesson, it never was. It's a memory, a meditation, a lullaby for the curious heart. The Middle Ages often sit in our imagination as a time of rigidity and repression, where intimacy was either hidden away or harshly judged. But, as we've seen slowly, softly, beneath all the rules and rituals, there was something deeply, beautifully human. Yes, the Church laid out its expectations in precise, even severe terms. It built a scaffolding of rules around love and the body, when you could touch, how you could love, what was permitted and what was not. And those rules were felt not just in the pulpit, but in the bedrooms of peasants and nobles alike. They were stitched into wedding contracts, whispered during confession, and preached in stained glass silence. And yet, despite that towering presence of religious doctrine, daily life often hummed to a rhythm of its own. People found ways to love, to explore, to laugh, to break the rules quietly or boldly. They whispered to each other behind market stalls. They stole glances in candlelight. They wrote love songs, slipped notes, wore tokens of devotion hidden beneath woolen sleeves. The Church might have tried to shape intimacy with theology and tradition, but it couldn't rewrite the human heart. Remember the forbidden days we spoke of: Thursdays, Fridays, Sundays, seasons of abstinence, feast days, and fasts. These weren't just rules. They were obstacles that lovers danced around with quiet ingenuity. Even the most pious may have turned to one another on a cool, moonlit night, choosing warmth over worry, closeness over creed. And consider how medicine and mysticism were braided together. The same hands that poured holy water might also press yarrow into a healing tea. The same minds that feared the stain of sin also believed that intimacy could cleanse, restore, or even cure. Pleasure, in their eyes, could be both poison and balm, depending on the moment and the measure. The people of the Middle Ages lived with contradictions because they were, in every way, just like us. They longed for meaning. They craved connection. They searched for rules to make sense of the world, and then quietly stepped beyond them when love or loneliness demanded it. There's something tender in that tension, don't you think? weren't robots programmed by church decree, nor were they rebels without belief. They were parents and poets, farmhands and scribes, abbots and midwives, and each of them carried within their hearts a private world of dreams and desires, some sacred, some scandalous, most somewhere in between. A young woman might marry a man she had never met, only to find herself quietly yearning for the attentions of a traveling musician. A cloistered monk might struggle with dreams he couldn't name, lighting candles and writing psalms to soothe the ache. A baker's wife might pass a soldier in the village square and remember, with a blush, the wildness of youth before vows and veils. These are not just fantasies, they are fragments of lives once lived, and those fragments are everywhere, carved in margins of illuminated manuscripts, hinted at in letters and diaries, even tucked between the lines of moral sermons meant to suppress them. What we often forget is that history isn't just the story of kings and battles, it's the story of how people lived, how they touched, how they ached for one another, how they sought comfort in a world that was, so often, uncertain and cold. And in the Middle Ages, where death was near and life could change in the space of a single harvest, intimacy became even more precious. A warm hand beneath a wool blanket, a whispered vow in a darkened chapel, a shared smile that made a hard day softer. These moments mattered. They still do. Tonight, as you lie here, your breath deepening, your mind floating like parchment on ink-dark water, let those medieval hearts beat alongside yours. Let their joy and confusion, their guilt and delight, settle into the quiet rhythm of your dreams, because, in the end, their story is also ours. The names have changed, the clothes, the customs, but the longing to be seen, to be held, to be known, this is timeless. So let us not mock the strangeness of their beliefs, nor judge the awkwardness of their restrictions. Let us instead marvel at the grace with which they lived between heaven and earth, trying always to reconcile the sacred with the sensual, the flesh with the spirit. They were not perfect, neither are we, but in their imperfections they left behind a map, a warm, human story that whispers, "We were here, and we loved." Now, breathe slowly. You've walked through centuries tonight, through abbeys and inns, through marriage halls and quiet confessionals, through silk sheets and stone altars, through the soft, dim corridors of desire. May you carry with you the gentle reminder that love is never just one thing. It is messy, beautiful, complicated, and absolutely, always human. Sleep well, dear listener. Let these stories wrap around you like the woolen cloak of a long-forgotten lover. If your dreams carry you to candlelit halls or whispering woods, don't be surprised. History, after all, has always had a heartbeat. Good night, sweet dreams, and thank you for listening.